Welcome to DCF Investigations. Imagine standing on the edge of a dense, untamed forest. The year is 1590. The air is thick with the humidity of a North American summer, carrying the scent of pine, salt spray, and decaying leaves. You have just crossed a perilous ocean, battling storms and the threat of enemy warships, driven by a singular, desperate hope to reunite with your family. You step onto the sandy soil of Roanoke Island, your heart pounding in your chest. You expect the sounds of industry, the laughter of children, the smoke of hearth fires. Instead, you are met with silence. A silence so profound, so heavy, that it feels like a physical weight pressing down on your soul. The fort you built is dismantled. The houses are gone. Your friends, your daughter, your granddaughter, all vanished into the ether. The only clue is a single word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. This is not a scene from a piece of fiction. This is the haunting reality that greeted Governor John White, and it remains the starting point for the oldest and most enduring mystery in American history. Tonight, we do not just recount the facts. We descend into the darkness of the past to uncover the fate of the lost colony of Roanoke. To truly understand why 115 souls disappeared from the face of the earth, we must first transport ourselves back to the world they left behind. The late 16th century was not a time of peace or stability. It was an era defined by religious fervor, imperial ambition, and the clash of superpowers. England, under the rule of Queen Elizabeth I, was a scrappy, Protestant island nation trying to assert itself against the mighty Catholic Empire of Spain. The Spanish had already established a stranglehold on the New World, extracting vast fortunes of gold and silver from South and Central America. This wealth fueled the Spanish war machine, threatening the very existence of England. For the English, establishing a foothold in North America was not just about exploration. It was a matter of national survival. It was about strategic positioning, a base from which privateers could raid Spanish treasure fleets, and a sanctuary where the English flag could fly on foreign soil. The mastermind behind this ambitious project was Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of the Queen, a man of immense charm, intellect, and ruthlessness. Raleigh secured a royal patent to explore and settle lands not held by any Christian prince. But the tragedy of the lost colony did not begin in 1587. It began 2 years earlier, in 1585, with a military expedition that would sow the seeds of doom for the families that followed. This first attempt, led by Sir Richard Grenville and Ralph Lane, was a disaster of diplomacy. These were soldiers, not farmers. They were ill-equipped for the harsh realities of the Carolina coast, and even less equipped to handle relations with the indigenous people. Upon their arrival, a silver cup went missing. In a disproportionate act of retribution that would echo through history, the English burned a native village and destroyed their corn. This act of violence poisoned the well of goodwill. The local tribes, particularly the Croatoan, who had initially been curious and potentially welcoming, learned quickly that these newcomers were dangerous, unpredictable, and violent. The 1585 military colony eventually collapsed. Starving and desperate, the soldiers hitched a ride back to England with Sir Francis Drake, who happened to be passing by after a raid in the Caribbean. They left behind a power vacuum and a legacy of mistrust. But Sir Walter Raleigh was undeterred. He realized that a colony of soldiers would never be self-sustaining. To create a permanent English presence, he needed a different kind of settler. He needed families. He needed men, women, and children who were invested in the land, who would plant crops, build homes, and create a society. And so the expedition of 1587 was born. And this was to be the City of Raleigh. The target was not Roanoke Island, with its treacherous shallow waters and hostile neighbors, but the Chesapeake Bay, further north, a region with deep harbors and, hopefully, friendlier indigenous populations. Leading this new expedition was John White. White was an artist, a man who had traveled to the New World before, not as a conqueror, but as an observer. His watercolors of the flora, fauna, and native peoples remain some of the most important historical documents of the era. He was a man of sensitivity, deeply devoted to his family. Among the settlers were his daughter, Eleanor, and her husband, Ananias Dare. Eleanor was pregnant, carrying a child who would become a symbol of the colony's fragile hope. The fleet of 3 ships, the Lion, the Flyboat, and the Pinnace, departed Plymouth, in England, on May 8, 1587. The journey was fraught with tension. The pilot of the fleet, Simon Fernandez, was a Portuguese navigator with a reputation for piracy and a difficult temperament. Throughout the voyage, Fernandez clashed with John White. There were questionable decisions, missed opportunities to gather supplies, and a growing sense of unease among the passengers. They stopped in the Caribbean, at Santa Cruz and Puerto Rico. But the stops were brief and contentious. By the time they reached the Outer Banks of North Carolina in late July, the relationship between White and Fernandez had deteriorated completely. The plan was clear. Stop at Roanoke only long enough to check on a small garrison of 15 men that had been left behind by the previous expedition, and then move north to the Chesapeake Bay to establish the city. But when they arrived at Roanoke, they found a ghost town. The fort built by the soldiers 2 years prior was overgrown with melons and ravaged by deer. The houses were intact, but empty. The only sign of the 15 men was a single bleached skeleton found on the ground. It was a chilling omen. But the true betrayal came from Simon Fernandez. As the settlers prepared to head north to the Chesapeake, Fernandez refused to take them. He claimed the summer was too far gone, and that his sailors needed to leave for the Caribbean to hunt for Spanish prizes before returning to England. He dumped the 117 settlers, men, women, and children, on the very island where the previous military colony had failed, but amidst a native population that had been antagonized and attacked by Englishmen just 2 years prior. They were stranded. The settlers set about repairing the cottages and the fort. They tried to establish contact with the local tribes. The Croatoan people, living on a neighboring island to the south, showed some willingness to talk, though they were wary. They told John White that the 15 men left behind had been attacked by a coalition of hostile tribes and driven off. The Secatan, the tribe that had suffered the burning of their village, remained elusive and dangerous. Tragedy struck quickly. A settler named George Howe was crabbing alone in the mesmerizing waters of the Sound when he was ambushed. He was shot with 16 arrows and bludgeoned to death. The message was clear. They were not welcome. Amidst this rising tide of fear, a ray of light broke through. On August 18th, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. She was named Virginia, the first English child born in the New World. Another child was born shortly after to the Harvey family. These births should have been a cause for celebration, a sign of the colony's future. Instead, they underscored the terrifying vulnerability of their situation. Supplies were running low. The planting season had been missed. The hostility of the mainland tribes was escalating. The settlers held a council. They realized they could not survive the winter, let alone the years to come, without significant support from England. They needed a representative to return home, someone with enough status to ensure that relief ships would be sent immediately. And they begged John White to go. He was reluctant. He did not want to leave his daughter and his newborn granddaughter in such a precarious place. He feared that if he left, his reputation would be ruined. That people would say he abandoned his post. But the voices of the 115 others outweighed his own. He agreed to go, extracting a promise from them. He told them that if they were forced to leave the island for any reason, they should carve the name of their destination on a tree or a post. If they were leaving in distress, if they were under attack or facing starvation, they were to carve a Maltese cross above the name. On August 27th, just 9 days after his granddaughter's birth, John White boarded the ship and watched the coastline of Roanoke fade into the horizon, or he believed he would be back within a few months. He could not have known that the world was about to conspire against him in the most catastrophic way possible. When White arrived in England, he found the nation on a war footing. The Cold War with Spain had turned hot. King Philip II of Spain was assembling the Armada, the greatest fleet the world had ever seen, with the express purpose of invading England and overthrowing Queen Elizabeth. Every seaworthy ship in England was commandeered for the defense of the realm. Sir Walter Raleigh attempted to organize a relief expedition, but the Queen's Privy Council forbade any ships from leaving that were not essential to the war effort. White managed to squeeze onto 2 small pinnaces that were cleared to leave because they were deemed too small for naval combat. But in a cruel twist of fate, the captains of these small ships were more interested in piracy than rescue. They attacked Spanish vessels, got into battles they couldn't win, and were stripped of their supplies. Beleaguered and humiliated, they limped back to England. John White was grounded. For 3 agonizing years, he sat in England, gazing west across the Atlantic, knowing that every passing day diminished the chances of his family's survival. He missed the first birthdays of his grandchild, the changing of the seasons, the critical moments where his leadership was needed most. Finally, in 1590, after the Spanish Armada had been defeated and the seas were somewhat safer, White secured passage on a privateering expedition. He was not the commander. He was merely a passenger, a dependent on the whims of a captain who was more interested in plunder than in passengers. The journey was slow. They raided Spanish outposts in the Caribbean, wasting precious time. It was August, hurricane season, when they finally approached the Outer Banks. As they neared Roanoke Island, the sailors spotted a plume of smoke rising from the land. White's heart leaped. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. They fired a cannon to signal their arrival, waiting for a response that never came. The seas were rough, the currents treacherous. In their attempt to reach the shore, a boat capsized and 7 sailors drowned. The mood among the crew turned dark. They blamed White and his colony for the bad luck. It was only with great difficulty that White convinced them to continue the search. As night fell, they anchored off the island, and they played trumpet calls and sang English folk songs loudly into the darkness, hoping to hear a familiar voice call back. But the only answer was the wind and the crashing waves. When the sun rose, they went ashore. They found the fire that had caused the smoke. But it was a natural brush fire, not a signal flare. They pushed through the woods to the site of the settlement. What they found, or rather, what they didn't find, has puzzled historians for over 4 centuries. The settlement was surrounded by a strong palisade of tree trunks, built in a defensive manner that hadn't existed when White left. Inside the perimeter, the houses had been taken down. This was a crucial detail often overlooked. The houses weren't burned or destroyed by attack. They were dismantled. This suggested a planned, orderly departure, not a sudden flight from a massacre. White walked to the entrance of the palisade. There, on a post, the bark had been peeled away, and a single word was carved in capital letters: Croatoan. On another tree nearby, the letters CRO were found. White frantically searched for the Maltese cross, the agreed-upon sign of distress. He checked every post, every tree. There was no cross. To John White, the message was clear. They had moved to Croatoan Island, the home of the friendly chief Manteo, who had traveled to England with their previous expeditions and had been baptized. Croatoan was only 50 miles to the south. White was relieved. He believed his family was safe with allies. He returned to the ship, demanding they sail to Croatoan immediately. But the weather, which had been threatening for days, finally broke. A massive storm, and likely a hurricane, descended upon them. Anchors snapped. The ships were nearly driven onto the shoals. The captain, fearing the loss of his vessel and crew, made a callous decision. They could not go to Croatoan. They had to head for deep water and return to the Caribbean or England to refit. John White stood on the deck, helpless, as the winds blew him away from his daughter and granddaughter for the second and final time. He would never return to America. He died years later in Ireland, a broken man, never knowing the ultimate fate of the lost colony. But where history goes silent, investigation begins. What actually happened to the 115 settlers? Over the centuries, dozens of theories have been proposed, ranging from the plausible to the preposterous. To understand the truth, we must dissect the suspects, the motives, and the evidence. The first and most widely accepted theory is the one John White himself believed: assimilation. The carving Croatoan was not a riddle. It was an address. The settlers, realizing they had been abandoned, likely waited as long as they could. As food stocks dwindled and relations with the mainland tribes remained hostile, they moved south to live with the Croatoan people on what is now Hatteras Island. This theory is supported by oral histories from the Hatteras tribes recorded in the 1700s. Early explorers in the region reported meeting Native Americans with gray eyes, light hair, and ancestors who could talk in a book, implying they could read. They claimed to have white ancestors. The assimilation theory suggests that the settlers intermarried, adopted the local culture, and slowly faded into the indigenous population. However, this theory has a complication. Why would the entire colony move to a small island that couldn't support such a large population increase? This leads us to the split community hypothesis. It is highly probable that the colony divided. A smaller group, perhaps the sick, the elderly, and women with young children, might have gone to Croatoan to live with Manteo. The larger group, the able-bodied men and women, may have attempted to fulfill the original mission, moving north to the Chesapeake Bay. This brings us to the Powhatan slaughter theory. Years after the disappearance, the English established the Jamestown colony in Virginia. Captain John Smith, the leader of Jamestown, was captured by the powerful Chief Powhatan. According to writings from the time, a Powhatan told Smith that he had wiped out a group of people who wore clothes like the English and lived with a tribe to the south. He even produced artifacts, a musket barrel, a brass mortar, and iron tools, to prove he had encountered them. The theory posits that the main group of Roanoke settlers managed to reach the Chesapeake area, lived there peacefully for nearly 20 years, and were then massacred by Powhatan's priests just before the Jamestown settlers arrived. Perhaps because of a prophecy that men from the east would destroy his empire. Then, there is the Spanish theory. We know the Spanish were actively hunting for the English colony. They saw it as a pirate nest that needed to be exterminated. There are records of Spanish pilots searching the coast. However, detailed archives in Seville have been scoured by historians. And while there are plans to attack Roanoke, there is no record of the attack ever taking place. The Spanish eventually found the site, but like John White, they found it empty. It is unlikely the Spanish were responsible, for if they had been, they would have boasted about it to the king. We must also consider the darker possibilities: internal strife, starvation, and disease. Could the colonists have turned on one another? Without leadership, discipline breaks down. A Lord of the Flies scenario is not impossible. But if they had died of starvation or disease at the site, where were the bodies? John White found no mass graves, no scattered skeletons. The orderly dismantling of the houses argues against a chaotic collapse. In the 20th century, a bizarre chapter was added to the mystery, with the discovery of the Dare Stones. In 1937, a tourist found a stone in a swamp with a message carved into it. The message, allegedly written by Eleanor Dare to her father John White, described the death of half the colonists and their subsequent misery. It was signed with her name. Initially, the stone was hailed as the answer, but then more stones appeared, dozens of them, telling a fantastic story of the survivors trekking across the country to Georgia. The later stones were exposed as clumsy forgeries, created by locals hoping to cash in on the reward money. However, the first stone, the quartz stone, has never been definitively proven to be a fake. Modern linguistic analysis suggests the spelling and grammar are consistent with the Elizabethan era, but the taint of the subsequent hoaxes keeps it in the realm of skepticism. So, where does the investigation stand today? Is the case cold? Far from it. In fact, the last decade has seen more breakthroughs than the previous 4 centuries combined. The investigation has moved from the history books to the science labs and archaeological trenches. In 2012, researchers at the British Museum were examining a watercolor map painted by John White himself. They noticed a small paper patch that had been pasted over a section of the map, likely to correct a mistake or hide a secret. Using modern imaging technology, they peered beneath the patch. What they found was shocking. Hidden under the paper was a symbol of a large, star-shaped fort, located some 50 miles inland from Roanoke at the head of the Albemarle Sound. And this site, dubbed Site X, was never mentioned in the official records. It suggests that the settlers had a secret Plan B, a predetermined fallback location known only to the leaders. Archaeologists rushed to Site X. What they found was tantalizing. They unearthed English pottery, specifically border ware, which was the Tupperware of the Elizabethan age. They found metal objects, priming pans for guns, and other domestic items that dated specifically to the late 16th century. These were not trade goods. They were items used by Europeans living in the area. The evidence strongly suggests that a group of survivors lived at Site X for some time. Simultaneously, excavations on Hatteras Island, the home of the Croatoan, have yielded similar treasures. A signet ring made of gold, bearing a Lusian crest, was discovered in a native pit. A lead slate used for writing, copper eyelets for clothing, and sword hilts have been found mixed in with indigenous artifacts. This physical evidence reinforces the split community theory. Some went inland to Site X, some went south to Croatoan. But the most cutting-edge frontier of this investigation is DNA. The Lost Colony DNA Project is currently underway. Scientists are collecting DNA samples from families in eastern North Carolina who have long-standing oral traditions of descending from the colonists. They are comparing this genetic data with DNA from the known relatives of the Roanoke settlers in England. It is a massive genealogical puzzle. They are looking for specific Y chromosome markers and mitochondrial DNA that could prove a biological link. If a match is found, it would be the final, irrefutable proof that the settlers did not vanish. But rather, they became the ancestors of the people who live there today. As we analyze the totality of the evidence, the picture that emerges is not one of a sudden supernatural disappearance, but of a slow, heartbreaking diaspora. It is a story of adaptation and survival. The settlers of Roanoke were abandoned by their country, betrayed by their suppliers, and left to fend for themselves on the edge of the known world. They did not simply lay down and die. They took down their houses, packed their belongings, and made the difficult choice to separate. They integrated into the landscape that had tried to reject them. They became the Croatoan. They became the people of the Albemarle. They ceased to be English and became the first true Americans. A blend of the old world and the new, forged in the fires of necessity. Yet the mystery retains its power because of the silence. We have the pottery shards, the maps, and the theories, but we lack the diary entries. We lack the final words of Ananias Dare. We do not know how Virginia Dare died, or if she lived a long life under a different name, raising children who looked at the stars and wondered about the white grandfather who sailed away and never came back. The silence of Roanoke is the silence of the voices we lost, the stories that were never written down. In the end, the word Croatoan was not a tombstone, but a signpost. It pointed the way to survival, a way that history, for centuries, refused to see. The lost colony was never truly lost. It was just absorbed into the vast, complex tapestry of American history. You're waiting for us to look closely enough to see the threads. This brings us to the end of our journey into the shadows of 1587. But at DCF Investigations, the file is never truly closed. New dig sites are being approved. New DNA results are pending. The sand of the Outer Banks shifts with every storm. And who knows what artifacts are waiting to be revealed by the next hurricane. Now, I turn the investigation over to you. Do you believe the settlers were slaughtered by Powhatan before they could be rescued? Or do you believe they successfully assimilated and their descendants are walking among us today, unaware of their lineage? Perhaps you believe the first dare stone is genuine. A final, desperate letter from a daughter to her father. Think about the psychological toll on John White. Mavers living out his days, knowing he failed the people he loved most. Think about the resilience of Eleanor Dare, keeping her child alive in a hostile wilderness. If you have a theory, however obscure, or if you live in North Carolina and have heard local legends passed down through your family, I want to hear them. Leave your detailed thoughts in the comments below. We read everything. If you found value in this deep dive, if you felt the chill of the Roanoke winds, please engage with the channel. Like the video to help us combat the algorithm, and subscribe to DCF Investigations for more exhaustive, long-form documentaries into the world's darkest mysteries. We don't just scratch the surface. We dig until we hit the bone. Until next time, keep your eyes open, and remember, history is only as silent as we allow it to be. Stay safe.